Now we initiate the plenary session 2 on controlling fraud, corruption, and other undesirable practices in emergency procurement and supply management. Let's welcome on the digital dais. We welcome the session chair, Mr. K. Rajendran, Chief Vigilance Officer, Cochin Shipyard Limited, and our panel of speakers, Mr. Mihály Fazekas, Assistant Professor, Central European University, Non-Resident Research Fellow, University of Cambridge, UK, and Senior Research Associate, the University College London. We'll welcome Ms. Yamini Sarangi, Managing Director, Odisha State Medical Corporation, India. We welcome on the digital dais Ms. Bernadine, Fernz, Global Head Infrastructure, Open Contracting Partnership, UK, and Mr. Gaurav Godhwani, Co-founder and Director, Civic Data Lab, India. A very warm welcome to all of you. With this, I hand over the session to the session chair, Mr. K. Rajendran.
Thank you. I welcome all the speakers to this session 2. Wherever you are, it may be good morning, good evening, or good night. I welcome you all to this session. The session is on controlling fraud, corruption, and other undesirable practices in emergency procurement and supply management. The session will go like this. I will give an introductory remark why the need of the session, and then speaker 1, Mr. Mihály Fazekas, will talk about using data analytics for detecting corruption and collusion in public procurement. And after this, he will have a Q&A. And since he has requested specially for that, for other speakers, the Q&A will be combined together at the last of the session. And after that, there will be a summing up will be there. In the introduction, I would like to say the session is very much important, and because under normal circumstances itself, the procurement budgets will often fluctuate between 30 to 20% of the country's GDP. This is as per the Transparency International, which is estimated to be around $9.5 trillion in a year. This is normal procurement. And UNODC also estimates it's around 10 to 15% is the procurement budget, and it is around 2.4 trillions. They are estimating the fraud may happen out of this 9.5 trillion. So the topic becomes utmost importance, since a lot of due to the any disaster happens, not only to the COVID, any disaster happened, it is followed with a lot of procurement scandals and corruption issues. So I would like to first highlight why the topic has been kept. Two things has been kept in the topic. One is fraud and another is corruption. Generally, people may take it as synonymous. Why fraud and corruption has been kept as their topic? Because as a practitioner of anti-corruption, we feel that the major difference between fraud and corruption in a legal sense is that fraud can be committed on an individual level. That means he can cheat the organization by making false billing, or he can do a quantity variations himself in a contract, or he can submit in plain a false biodata for getting a job. So this will come under fraud. And corruption means it requires collusion with another person. Fraud involves generally a betrayal of trust, and corruption involves breach of trust. So that is the major difference between fraud and corruption. So only fraud in a contract, fraud can also happen, a corruption can also happen. So even though in the Indian context, Indian Penal Code doesn't define fraud exactly, but Section 17 of the Indian Contract Act defines the fraud correctly, which says that any act amount to fraud which are a false claim, active concealment, promise without the intention of carrying it out, any other deceptive act, or any declared fraudulent act. So this is as per the Indian Contract Act, and because fraud happens due to social, political, and economic stress. So present opportunities for corrupt actors. So these are the opportunities, because if there is a social stress, if there is a political stress, it may happen. And the crisis caused by the novel coronavirus is not an exception. So every time the fraud happens, this type of things, every time any disaster happens, this type of things happens. As per the report to the nations 2020 by the Fraud Institute, the high risk departments in the occupational fraud schemes are purchasing is 81%, and executive and upper management is 62%. This is as per the 2019 survey. This is not 2020 survey, which has not yet to come. So we can understand that how it is volatile and why this topic is very much important in a procurement. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed weakness in the global supply chain system, the national procurement systems, ability to secure essential personal protective equipment, ICU material, and COVID test. Lot of corruption has happened in these things. For example, it is in the Spanish government discovered that out of 340,000 tests purchased from a Chinese manufacturer, 60,000 of them did not test accurately for COVID-19 tests. So, and Dutch Ministry of Health issued a recall of 600,000 face mask from a Chinese supplier due to poor quality. So there was lot of problems in UK also, and selling at extremely high prices are also widespread, and price gouging and investigations by authorities can be found throughout Europe and the US, but also in developing countries like Indonesia, Brazil, Thailand, Kenya, and South Africa, and in Ecuador and Paraguay, with the corruption as the alleged cause. This is reported by the OECD in their report. I quote from the OECD report only. So Indonesia, even the last disaster also, even World Bank is having a experience, and World Bank has deducted lot of malpractices during the tsunami funds. And after that only they have made a lot of improvements in their anti-corruption strategies. The KPK was formed, and a lot of systems are being developed in Indonesia. And procurement failures in general are directly traceable to the abuse of the increased discretion granted by the emergency procurement rules to urgently source material and bypass time-consuming public procurement process and legal frameworks. So because any disaster happens, the first thing is to get the relief. So how to get the relief? So at that time, it is the prices are jacked or the competition is getting reduced, so that the actors are getting benefited. Example in the press, even in COVID-19 situation, it was very much examples are there. In UK, clearly a non-urgent contract was awarded without competition to a firm owned by two long-term associates of Michael Gove and Dominic Cummings. This is also quoted by the Transparency International. In Slovenia also, a gambling mogul with no public record of healthcare experience appears to have received millions in the emergency contract related to COVID-19. So, and in Bosnia also, a Rapsberg firm was apparently granted a contract to import 100 ventilators. In India also, a Mumbai realtor with no previous healthcare experience got a contract to supply things as oxygen cylinder, medical beds, etc. So throughout the world, during the COVID-19, many things have happened, and it is being monitored. So the health minister in Bolivia was arrested in May after the country bought 179 ventilators at $27,683 each, while it was later revealed that the manufacturers were offering ventilators at approximately half the price. So we can understand how the damage it has done. And so according to Transparency International, up to 25% of all global healthcare procurement spending is lost to corruption due to the COVID-19. This is one of the benchmark. I leave it to the speakers to talk about. This is Transparency International, as in 2020 they released a article in that they have told that 25% of all global healthcare procurement spending is lost to corruption. In general, emergent procurements drives away transparency, increases the discretion, and reduces the competition. So these are the hallmark of emergency procurement. So how to make a emergency procurement? In India also it has been dealt clearly by the procurement manual of goods released by the government of India. In chapter 8.2, they have clearly told how the emergency procurement should be. So now I will invite, so summing up, we will have a detailed discussions about how in G20 also, India has presented their view for the questionnaires. All these things I will come up during the summing up session. Now I will invite Mr. Mihály Fazekas, Assistant Professor, Central European University, to present his view on the topic and how data analytics will help in detecting corruption and collusion public procurement. Welcome, Mr. Fazekas.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me well?
Yeah.
Super. It's the first time I'm using this connection. Welcome everyone, the audience. I must apologize. This is my holidays and it's early on for me, so I'm back home in the presence of toys. But need not worry. Nevertheless, I brought my brightest ideas in spite of the conditions. So I will try to share my screen and walk you through the main findings of my research. Okay, do you see it?
Yeah.
My first slide?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, so I have 2 main points and about 15 minutes to cover them, or maybe a little longer, but I will not be long. So we have heard Transparency International numbers. We have heard over and over again metrics from corruption perception surveys, and I'm here to put out a very simple message that corruption and corruption risks in public procurement can be measured in public procurement in a very different way using proxy indicators, objective proxy indicators based on administrative data. And this is fundamentally different from corruption perception surveys because we have specificity to a sector, we have detail, you can go down to the individual contract level, and we have a very clear link to policy interventions because the sorts of red flags and indicators, corruption risk indicators, which can be measured, they directly respond to interventions. So we have a chance of changing things and tracking if these new policies improve corruption risk outcomes. So corruption can be proxied in public procurement, but of course there is not a dreamland. We have conditions to be met. We need sufficient scope for the data, for the procurement contracting data, sufficient quality of the data. And I think my colleagues will talk about data a little bit more, so I will just talk about it very briefly. And I also want to say that COVID-19 and other emergency procurement situations require a special treatment, a special approach, modification of the measurement framework to fit the realities of emergency procurement. We have recently won the IMF Anti-Corruption Challenge, where we set out a range of indicators and how it relates to spending in various emergency and non-emergency periods. And finally, I will demonstrate the analysis using public procurement data from the federal government of India. So let me start with the measurement framework. So how do we proxy corruption? How do we come up with estimates of corruption and corruption risk in public procurement? First, you have to figure out what you want. So whether you measure legal compliance or you want to measure the underlying corrupt acts and proxying, estimating them. So in our case, we will have a corruption risk approach, corruption proxy approach. The sort of corruption is very important. Are we after fraud? Are we after organized high risk, high value forms of corruption. And this is what our goal will be, because it's easier to measure. And then once we decide on what we want to do, what we want to measure, we need to have a list of potential indicators, promising indicators, right? So that's very important, because not all red flags which pop up in court cases, journalistic reports or theory, not all of them are valid in a particular country's large-scale data set. Then we have to collect the data, clean it, that's the hard part, I will talk about that a little bit. And finally, we have to have tailoring and validation. There's not a single red flag which works in exactly the same way in every country. We have to tailor the indicators to the context, and we have to do thorough validation. We have to see which indicators with which parameters are likely to suggest corruption risk rather than something else which looks similar in the data but fundamentally different, such as low capacity or genuine emergency rather than emergency exploited for corrupt means. So I will walk you through these 5 steps. First, the general, giving you examples from a range of other countries, and finally, and point 5 and how we use the data, I will turn to India. So how we define corruption in public procurement? I want to warn you that the definition I'm using is not precisely the legal definition. Instead, it's coming from the World Bank, and this is also a definition which is corresponds to ordinary understandings of corruption, as a lot of social sciences theory backing it up. So basically, to talk about corruption in public procurement, we need 2 fundamental conditions to be met. First, avoiding competition in a place, in a contract, in a market where you would expect competition in the absence of corruption. And then second, very importantly, second, using this limited competition to the favor of a certain bidder who is connected, paid a bribe, or donated to a party campaign, what have you. So basically, limited competition favoring a certain bidder, 2 conditions we try to measure. Just stopping here for a second. Do you hear me well? All good? Yes?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, super. So let me move on from the definition to conceptualizing indicators and how we can get to indicators which measure these 2 things. So in public procurement, corruption targets the contract, obviously, it has been mentioned, overpricing and other wrongdoing. We have 2 actors, the suppliers and a contracting body. And then because we are talking about corruption, we have a particularistic relationship, a personal relationship between the 2. That's the informal side of the deal. Now, what's nice about this very simple 4-element framework is that you can have 4 groups of indicators related to the framework. First, and that's where most people look at indicators, is looking at the tendering risks. So biases in the process of tendering, awarding a contract. Here you can think about corruption proxies like single bidding, 1 bid submitted on a competitive market, or very short advertisement period. So nominally there is competition, there is an open tender, but actually the deadline was so tight that only that company could submit a bid which has friends in the procuring entity which knew about the opportunity well in advance. Supplier risk indicators are very important and less widely used. They cover things like tax haven registration of the supplier. So a construction company building a highway in Georgia, but registered in the Cayman Islands, right? That would be a very high risk constellation. Now, we also have risk indicators on the contracting body side. This is the least frequently used indicator, although very important as well. Here, the indicators cover things like political pressure on the procurement function in a procuring entity. And finally, we have political connections indicators. So now we're talking about COVID-19 and emergency procurement. And what's very important, that tendering risks, by the nature of emergency, tend to be very high, and because in many cases, basically tendering risks cover every tender, every contract. They lose their discriminant value. We lose their capacity to differentiate between high risk and low risk transactions. So we have to shift our measurement framework towards supplier risk indicators and political connections indicators. So it's not how procurement is done, but who is winning and who is behind those suppliers. So that's an important shift in the measurement framework, simply due to the emergency nature. Of course, post-emergency period, we can move back to a more balanced measurement framework with both tendering risk indicators and the three others. So let me talk about data very briefly, because I know it will be covered later on. So collecting and standardizing data is the hardest part of our work. And I also work at the Government Transparency Institute, which has collected and republished data from 48 countries, covering over 50 million public contracts, 6 million government suppliers, and 1 million public organizations or procuring entities. So this is when the data is collected from official government repositories or advertisement websites like HTML pages or APIs if the data is structured. And this data is then pulled together in a standardized structure. And this information, this data set is cleaned according to joint common standards. And then the data can be used both for comparative and in-country work analysis. And I will, you could see India federal government is covered. We have around 700,000 tenders here. So I will tell you a few words about how our framework can be adapted to India's federal government. So indicators, I'm walking through my steps of developing red flags. So we have a long list of indicators from social sciences research, from case studies, from journalists, and then we have to adopt them, then we have to test them. Now, the basic test for any indicator is whether it behaves according to a corrupt logic. And one condition I mentioned is lack of competition, avoiding competition. So we have a sort of logic whereby the tendering process, the characteristics of the tendering process should be associated, should lead to limited competition. So one example here for a basic test is whether there was an advertisement of the procurement portal, yes or no, whether that leads to smaller or higher risk or probability of single bidding. So one bid submitted on a competitive market. This is an example coming from Mexico's federal procurement data. And what you see is the risk of, or a probability of single bidding jumps from 23% to close to 50%. So it doubles, right? And this is exactly the sort of logic and sort of behavior you expect from a corrupt technique, that you avoid tendering publication, call for tender publication. As a result, it makes it easier for your cronies to get a contract without competition, hence overpricing and other problems, right? So we have a series of such tests for each of the potential red flags or proxy indicators of corruption. And those which pass these tests and a number of others, like predicting prices, that's one of our work for the IMF. So then each of these indicators passes the test, we pass it through. Then we say, okay, this indicator with these particular parameters, they are red flags which indicate corruption risk rather than something else. And then they can be pulled together into a composite corruption risk index. Okay, another indication that's rare, but I just want to tell you that this also exists. There are rare cases where we can see both certainly proven corrupt cases and certainly proven non-corrupt cases. This is an example coming from Italy, where municipalities have been infiltrated by the mafia, and the central government recognizes this, dissolves the local council and takes over management of the municipalities directly from Rome. So we have a very nice before-after setup where indicators of corruption risk in procurement shoot up before the dissolution. So that's the red line, or the vertical dashed line, and then a drop in the indicator once central government steps in. And this is exactly what you see, jumping from around 30% to down to around 10%. And this is single bidding, and a number of other indicators like non-open procedures follow very much the same pattern. This is an Italian example, but nevertheless gives us confidence that beyond statistical evidence, proven cases also underpin these indicators. So let me finish off, but some applications to India, the federal government. I understand there is a particular interest from most of the audience. So let's see what this methodology looks like in the Indian case. So we have collected data from the eProcure website, both the old one and the newest version from 2013 and 16. So the data doesn't cover the emergency procurement. For the main reason to that is the new portal has CAPTCHA protection, so we cannot download the data from the website. We cannot scrape the website, which is a major impediment from data collection. So if anyone from the Indian government is watching, I very much would recommend removing this CAPTCHA protection so that the data can be collected and used by businesses, civil society, and researchers like myself. Nevertheless, there is a sufficient large data set to develop the following 6 red flags, develop and validate. The 6 red flags are the following: single bidding, which I have shared with you, winner contract share, so it's a sort of localized market concentration index, Benford's law. Benford's law is based on the suspicious distribution of digits in contract values, non-open procedure type, so that's a sort of direct award as opposed to open auction, very short advertisement period, so a handful of days of advertising, and then product description being way longer than the market average, suggesting that potentially the description was tailored to a particular company. So we pull together these 6 red flags into a composite score between 0 and 1, 1 meaning the highest risk, 0 being the lowest risk, and focusing on those 170,000 contracts for this 4-year period where data quality is sufficient. We have the following distribution, with bulk of the contracts having low to no red flags, so 0.2, 0.3 CRI would mean 2 in 6 or 1 in 3 red flags present. So it's not particularly outrageous, particularly suspicious. But when you get to 0.8, 0.1, that's where we start to be worried, because when you have 5 out of 6 or 6 out of 6 red flags in a contract, these are very basic red flags, so let me go back to the list, then those contracts seem to have particularly high corruption risk. If we turn this around and we aggregate to the largest buyers of the federal government, and we looked at the 379 largest buyers with at least 50 contracts awarded, and we look at the highest risk entities, so those having average CRI of 0.7, 0.8, or even 0.95, those are the entities which have a large number of contracts and consistently high risk, right? So 0.8 or 0.7, I mean that on average, in all its contracts of that particular procuring entity, it has, I don't know, 5 out of 6, 4 out of 6 red flags present. So it's consistently high risk activity. This is a risk indicator, so there's a more in-depth analysis to be done to understand why this is the case. Nevertheless, there is, in our research and practice, this is a cause for concern and definitely a risk pattern which stands out. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I stick to my time, and looking forward to your questions.
Yeah. all the questions may not be answered. I request Aima to select few questions, and the other questions may be mailed to Fazekas, and he can mail the answers to the people directly. So due to the paucity of time, I request the Aima to take one or two important questions which they feel. Otherwise, all the questions, whoever it can be mailed to Fazekas to get a reply from him, and it can be directed to the participants.
And I'm happy to share my presentation so you can follow up on the methodology and the details. We have tailored recommendations for the Indian federal government as part of our DFID or now FCDO funded research project. So those could be maybe also interesting for the local participants.
Any questions?
There are a couple of in the chat, but I don't know if there are others.
Yeah. So actually what happened, Fazekas, in India, when you go to the e-procurement portal, which we are doing, even I have told that the key terms are used inconsistently. That terms... Please?
What is used inconsistently?
That means the tender type, somebody mentioned some other word, somebody mentioned procurement type, somebody mentioned tender type. So catching these things, there is no uniformity among the words being used by each department. So which we are trying to make up. Each department and each state is using different words. So capturing data is becoming very difficult. And the award data is also not available, which we are trying to tell to the organizations to upload the award data also, not only the NITs. I think.
Yes, exactly. This is one of the shortcomings we also came across, that there is only a few 100,000 contract awards on the procurement website, but you could see that there is over 1 million call for tenders. So tenders started. So there is more than a 50% gap between the suspected number of total tenders and the tenders which have
that may empirically change the data what we are arriving if all the data are available.
That's great. So I see two questions, so let me answer those very quickly if I have a minute or so. So the first question goes, are there any off-the-shelf digital tools which can be deployed by public agencies to better detect and mitigate fraud and corruption risks? So the answer is yes and no. The answer is yes, because the methodology which I presented has been applied for more than 50 countries by now. So this is, well, as much off the shelf as it gets. But the off-the-shelf part is where I would warn you that corruption, by fundamentally is similar across countries. It takes different forms from country to country. So I don't advise you just to take, the same indicators what I presented on Mexico and then without checking them run in India. It's not working like that. You have a repository of risk indicators and the methodologies for tailoring and testing them in each country. You have to do that. But then once it's true that there's a range of dashboards, a range of standard reports which you can do. Maybe the OCP colleague will talk about this in a bit. We also have the analytics dashboards which can be readily used and deployed once the data work and indication work is there. I can drop in the chat the link. It's called open10.eu. That covers 33 European countries. It has an application for a couple of other countries outside Europe. This is among others. That's one of the ready-made tools which can be adopted and used. Now, the second question is about, are there examples where data analytics has helped to detect supplier collusion? So I deliberately steered clear of collusion topic because it's a big topic on its own. And I had a little time to go over the material, but the quick answer is yes. There is a large economics literature around the cartel screens or indicators or risk indicators for collusion among suppliers. At the Government Transparency Institute, we have a stream of research projects and the policy applications in a number of countries, like Swedish with the Swedish Competition Authority, Greek Competition Authority, and a couple of others, where we apply similar metrics, similar logic, just to the collusion topic. And yes, this can guide investigations. There are concrete cases in these countries where analytics pointed at particular companies and markets. Then there was further investigation online on these companies. And then in some cases, the analytics eventually led to down rates. So when the competition authority shows up in the offices of the company, takes away computers, information, paper, what have you. And this has led to, conviction. So that's the power of this data. Helps you target your investigative activities.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mihály, Fazekas. When I come to Vienna, I will meet you. I am coming there on April or May to IATA.
Yes, very much so. Please.
I will meet you. I thank you, and I thank you for your replies to the participants. Thank you for your presentation. We will meet you soon. And now I request Speaker 2, Mrs. Yamini Sarangi, IAS, Managing Director, Odisha Medical Services Corporation, to present her views.
Very good afternoon to everybody. Am I audible?
Yeah, audible, madam. Please go on.
I first of all would like to thank all the organizers, the organizing team, for inviting me for this great Global Procurement Summit. I'll just share my screen. Yeah, is my screen, can everybody see my presentation?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay, right, I'll start with it.
Yeah.
This is the structure of the presentation, the topic that I'm going to speak. First, very briefly about Odisha State Medical Corporation Limited. Then next would be how we do public procurement in the health sector in the state. What are the transparency measures that we adopt? And then lastly, what special measures were undertaken for COVID-19 emergency procurement. First, I'd just like to mention briefly about Odisha State Medical Corporation Limited. Now, Odisha State Medical Corporation Limited, or OSMCL, it was set up during November 3rd, 2013 as a wholly owned company of the government of Odisha. The main functions are, it is the nodal agency of the government of Odisha for procurement, storage and distribution of all essential medicines, consumables for all government healthcare facilities, ultimately for distribution of free medicines to all the people who come to the government healthcare facilities, down till the primary health centers as well as the sub-centers, under the state-funded scheme called Niramaya. It is also procuring all the requirements for the programs of National Health Mission, NHL. Secondly, OSMCL procures all the medical EIF, which is equipment, instruments and furniture for all government healthcare facilities. Also, it undertakes the repair and maintenance activities. Then recently, since 2019, just before just in January 2019, the scheme of Khushi, which is the scheme for free distribution of beltless sanitary napkins to all the adolescent girl students of the state, that is also undertaken by OSMCL. Now, this is very briefly about the staffing and structure. We have a very lean organization. We have 5 major divisions: the HR and admin, finance, drugs and surgical, equipment, and the quality assurance division. And also we have an IT cell, the information technology cell. Each is headed by a general manager who reports directly to the managing director. We have 39 district warehouses, where each is managed by one warehouse manager and a junior pharmacist. Then something to talk about file management. Now, this is a new achievement that we have accomplished since November 2020 recently, where our entire file management, both internal as well as external, which means the files that we send to let's say the secretary or other directorates of the health department, that is all online through this application called OSWAS, which is Odisha Secretariat Workflow Automation System. Bulk of our manpower is through outsourced mode, which includes office assistants. Basically, we don't have clerks or senior clerks as regular employees, because that is all managed on outsourced basis through office assistants. We have regular direct employees from the level of assistant manager and above, and senior pharmacists or the warehouse managers. The bulk of the manpower, like office assistants, DOs, housekeeping, etc., are through outsourced manpower service providers. Now, these are some latest updates about OSMCL. In the DVDMS portal, which is the Drugs and Vaccine Distribution Management System of the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India, which is a central dashboard, OSMCL has been consistently ranked in top 5. We came into these rankings, into this portal since January 2020, and we have been consistently in the top 5. As we can see here, the monthly state ranks in November the 2020 and May 2020. Similarly, OSMCL was adjudged by GEM, which is Government E-Marketplace, in November 2020 as the second top buyer amongst all state government organizations and local bodies in the country in terms of the order value. So this was also an achievement that we could achieve. This is another latest update, which is what here I'm trying to mention, that over a short period of time, when the corporation started its operations in 2015-16 financial year till 2020-21, we can see that there's been a quantum jump from the total expenditure that was accomplished in 2015-16 of 91.78 crore of rupees to 1033 till December 2020. So this is in brief about Odisha State Medical Corporation Limited. And now I would speak about the various transparency measures that we adopt in our public procurements. It starts from the indenting actually. The indenting for the various items, the medical items, the consumables, the surgical sutures, etc. It is done online by all the healthcare facilities, right from the primary healthcare centers, in the e-Niramaya portal. Now, e-Niramaya portal is a very robust IT platform that we have, which manages the complete procurement, distribution, and supply chain management inventory of all the items that are procured by OSMCL. And in this, indenting is done by these facilities directly. These are then rationalized by the concerned technical committees also online. So like PHCs, primary healthcare centers, will compile it and give it to the CHCs. CHCs then give it to the district, at the level of the CDMO, Chief District Medical Officer and Public Health Officer. And then finally at the state level, we have interdisciplinary committees, which includes these technical specialists from the directorates as well as from the medical institutions, who then rationalize these indents. So this is all done online. Similarly, the approval of indents is also done at the apex level by, we have two committees, the State Drug Management Committee and the State Equipment Management Committee, which then goes through these indents and approves these indents. So these committees are multidisciplinary. They have, as I said, members from the directorates, the technical specialists, from the districts, from the medical health, medical colleges and hospitals as well. So there is a system of check and balance to see that indenting is done properly. When it comes to tendering, we compulsorily do tenders only through either the government e-marketing portal, which is the first priority. If the certain item is not available in the product categories of GEM, then we follow e-tendering in the portal of NIC, which is National Informatics Center. Only for the purpose of COVID, during the peak, which I'll come to later, during the national lockdown and when there was this peak shortage of items, that time temporarily for a few months, this provision was waived off. But since May 2020, all COVID procurements are also being done only through GEM or this e-tender portal. The notifications for the tenders are widely published in leading national newspapers, and all subsequent corrigenda in the tenders, whether let's say there is a change in the, let's say, the date line for where if we want to extend the deadline or there are certain other changes, these are all compulsorily given in the OSMCL's website. Tender evaluation is done by multidisciplinary committees, which comprises of committees comprising of specialists, not just from OSMCL, because OSMCL primarily being the procurement organization, the committees are multidisciplinary. We have, for example, for equipment procurement, we have the senior biomedical engineers in the committees, as well as the main technical specialists, the HODs of various departments from external organizations like AIIMS Bhubaneswar, or the state government's own medical colleges and hospitals, and also district headquarter hospitals. The decisions like selection or the rejection lists are immediately uploaded in the GEM portal if the tender is done in GEM, e-tender portal, and also on the OSMCL website, and preferably on the same day of the evaluation. The award of contract, once the tender is finalized, the evaluation is completed, the details of the contract are immediately uploaded in the GEM, which means when you generate the contract, obviously it is an IT portal, so it will have that. And also, if the tender has been done in the e-tender portal of NIC, and also we upload them in our website. The rate contract details are uploaded in the e-Niramaya portal, which I mentioned about, which is the IT platform for OSMCL's entire supply chain management of drugs, surgicals, etc., and also in the OSMCL's website. Next is about quality assurance, because we have a stringent quality protocol that we follow. This is also done online in the e-Niramaya portal. All the drugs and surgical items are first placed under something called a quarantine stage, and then they are released for active usage only after quality clearance, which means once the vendors have supplied the items to the various consignee locations, the items are first kept under quarantine stage and they are put for active usage only after quality clearance. Now, how quality clearance is done is through random sampling of each batch of goods that we receive. Now, this random sampling is also done through the software, which means there is no human intervention here to ascertain as to which samples will be drawn from, samples will be drawn from which consignee locations. Similarly, these samples are also allocated to NABL accredited empanel laboratories also through the software. OSMCL has its own empanel laboratories, which basically to empanel these laboratories, we do a tender, an expression of interest where we invite these NABL accredited laboratories to apply, and then we have this empanel list for a period of 1 year or 2 years, as the case may be. Like this year, it is for 1 year, and the samples are then which sample will go to which NABL accredited laboratory is also done but through the software. These suppliers, the laboratories also have been given an interface in the e-Niramaya system for them to upload the test reports, which means the laboratories which has tested the sample uploads the test reports directly in this portal. In the e-Niramaya portal, we also have an interface for the vendors to know about the status of the quality clearance of the consignments delivered by them. And decisions like replacement in case of quality non-clearance, let's say certain samples are then tested by the laboratories to be of non-standard quality, NSQ, that also we upload it in the e-Niramaya portal. As I mentioned, the entire inventory management is done through the e-Niramaya system. The stock receipt as well as issuance is compulsorily only done through the e-Niramaya system. And in the e-Niramaya system, we have an interface for the vendors to know about the delivery status as well as the acceptance status of their consignments. Similarly, payments are also done through e-Niramaya. The payment clearance is done in the e-Niramaya, and then the subsequent payment is done through the finance division through the tally system. The vendors do have an interface in e-Niramaya to know about the status of their payments. And lastly, any decisions of blacklisting or debarment of vendors is also immediately uploaded in the OSMCL website following due procedure, which is of giving them an opportunity of being heard and giving them a show cause notice, etc. And then these decisions are immediately uploaded in the OSMCL website. So this was about the measures, various transparency measures that we follow in public procurement in the health sector. Now I will speak about the measures and the way emergency procurement was done in Odisha for handling this pandemic of COVID-19. Now, this is just a news item to show how we played a key role in the COVID-19 to manage this pandemic. Now, since emergency procurement needs some special extraordinary provisions, especially when this pandemic was extraordinary in the sense that, and especially it came with the national lockdown, when there was immediately a scarcity, an acute scarcity of various items, particularly the PPEs, the masks, or the testing kits, or the ventilators, etc. So certain special provisions were made by the state government to enable these provisions. These are some of those. There was this special circular from the finance department, which was also very much in line with what the government of India had also issued in for these procurement of goods and services, where provisions for single tender inquiry or single source procurement, especially like for example, there was this procurement of TrueNat machines for testing, and these are proprietary. This is a proprietary equipment where there's only one supplier in the country, but these were allowed without inviting bids. And then the mandatory condition of procurement through GEM had also been relaxed. Similarly, the Revenue and Disaster Management Department, and in fact, the state government of Odisha was the first state in the country to declare it as a disaster, and associated with it, the Revenue and Disaster Management Department brought out these circulars where the health department was authorized by the state disaster management authority for emergency procurement for containment of the disaster situation due to this COVID-19. Then a very important decision was constitution of an emergency procurement committee, which had members at the very highest level, which had principal secretary, finance department, health department, industries department, senior officers from the National Health Mission of Odisha, then technical specialists from the directorates of health department, who were deciding the items and the quantity for urgent procurement by way of tender process, and also to decide the suppliers or the original equipment manufacturer for immediate supplier. All the decisions of the EPC, the Emergency Procurement Committee, were ratified by the empowered group of ministers, which had been also specially constituted for the purpose of COVID-19 procurements, and these are finally also approved by the state cabinet. There used to be frequent meetings of these so as to take quick decisions to meet the various challenges and the procurement issues. Now, these are some of the problems that were faced during this emergency procurement of COVID-19. There were wide variations in the frequency of receipt of indents. Normally, for example, in normal scenario, we let's say for drug items, we get an annual indent which is rationalized, and then you procure it, you establish rate contract or a quantity based tender for the which will meet the requirement for the entire year. But in the case of COVID-19, because it was a very unpredictable situation where the case load, where there were these projections of case loads were being done. So in that case, the various indents that we were receiving, there were wide variations. Similarly, in the quantity also, there were special committees which finalized the indents. These are which included members from cross-cutting departments, and there were special committees for defining the specifications. Now, because it was a special situation, so in that in this for the same item, procurement was done with different specifications. For example, ventilators. Now we have ventilators of varying specifications, but since time was of utmost concern, so it was allowed that ventilators of varying specifications could be procured, provided they are okayed by the technical committees, which were the head of departments of, let's say, for in the case of ventilators, it was the pulmonary medicine, similarly nebulizers or BiPAP, etc. Now, as far as for source selection, as I mentioned earlier, the clause for mandatory clause for procurement and GEM had been waived off, but this was for the peak time, which is between March, April, May. May onwards, and in fact June onwards, we have been only now procuring either through GEM or e-tender or through national bidding for all items, including testing kits or even now the cold chain equipment that we are now procuring. The tenders were waived off for that period when there was this acute shortage. However, even if the tenders were waived off, we had issued public notices in leading national dailies, prominent public notices, to invite suppliers to deliver goods to us after we had fixed a ceiling rate. For example, in the case of AAA masks, the ceiling rate, as was fixed by the Ministry of Consumer Affairs during that particular time, we had fixed it at a ceiling rate, and we invited suppliers, those who had the items, they could deliver it to us within these ceiling rates. Similarly, for PPEs, the rate that had been quoted to us by the CPSU HLL, which is this Hindustan Life, HLL Life Care Limited. So the rate that they had quoted to us for the PPEs, we kept it as the ceiling and invited suppliers to supply to us. Because of these special scenarios, the existing rate contracts had been extended for prolonged durations. Similarly, rate contract which had just recently expired, that those were also renewed. And most importantly, it was allowed by the EPC and further then ratified by the empowered group of ministers and the state cabinet to procure from multiple suppliers at multiple rates. Now, these are some of the innovative measures that had been followed for aggressive procurement. We had allowed suppliers for staggered delivery. Now, this was for the existing contracts. Now, when the pandemic set in by January 29th, that time itself, we already had some contracts with suppliers. But then since they requested later that because of this restriction on imports from China or other countries, and especially these KPIs of the pharmaceutical products. Now, in that case, those cases, as a special measure, we allowed suppliers to deliver on a staggered basis, which means the period of liquidated damages were were prolonged, which means they don't have to pay the liquidated damages. Similarly, we announced special incentives for quicker delivery of items, especially for these protective gears. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we had fixed ceiling rates for items like be it N95 masks or the personal protective equipment, PPE kits. And within that ceiling rate, we were procuring goods from suppliers whose quotations were found to be valid by the technical committees. Then we had also announced in those public notices that the transportation costs will be borne by OSMCL. In many cases, penalty clauses like LD, the liquidated damages, had been completely waived off. We had also made this, we had accepted this special provision that items with lesser shelf life were also accepted. Now, this is an example, for example, PPs. Now, normally they should have a shelf life of 24 months or 36 months, as this case may be. But since we knew that these items will be immediately used, so even if certain items had a lesser shelf life, those were also accepted. The testing charges, normally OSMCL imposes the testing charges of the various items on the suppliers. But in this case, for COVID-19, it is like an additional incentive to the suppliers that the testing charges were also borne by OSMCL. Now, there was no compromise on quality. And because during the national lockdown, these empaneled laboratories had closed down. So in that case, to continue testing, not so as not to have any glitches in testing, the State Drugs Testing and Research Laboratory was enhanced so that they could then test the drug samples or the surgical on our behalf. Similarly, we contacted CIPET, this Central Institute of Plastic Technology at Bhubaneswar, and they were also roped in for testing for certain items. Now, we allowed negotiated rates, payment through escrow account, advance payment to only CPSUs. Price revisions were also allowed, especially in the case of AAA masks, when the price revisions were huge. For example, in the month of December, January, December, we were procuring it at 90 paisa per mass, but by February it increased to 1 rupee 76 paisa. Then by March it increased to 10 rupees as per the Government of India notification, and then 16 rupees. Similarly, we lifted stocks from open market in the case of in the initial days for sanitizers especially. For transportation of these items, we also organize special air cargo operations, especially for testing kits, because of the fact that they had to maintain a cold chain. Now, these are some of the just examples and the photographs as to how these procurement was done. This is the central drugstore at the OSMCL headquarters in Bhubaneswar. Some snaps of the central drugstore at Bhubaneswar. And lastly, I would just mention the handling, how the audits have been handled and the being handled also with this audits. We had ensured, it was ensured by the health department that the EPC meetings are frequently convened, and also the EGOM meetings are frequently convened. We took all prior approval of all the indent specifications. In certain special circumstances, when all the decisions were taken in public interest, those were put forth for post facto approval. There was proper justification of multiple suppliers at multiple rates. There were also proper justification of all deviations which were recorded in writing, especially as I mentioned, for example, when we accepted certain items with lesser shelf life, knowing fully well that these will be utilized immediately. All these decisions were ratified by the EGOM and the state cabinet, and all such circumstances which were very extraordinary have been documented. So these are some of the measures that we had taken. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yamini ji. I request you to be online only, because after Mrs. Bernadine and Fernz and Gaurav, Godhwani, if participant delegates wants, they may ask for the questions. So I request you to stay back. Now I request Bernadine and Fernz, Open Contracting Partnership, and Mrs. Gaurav Godhwani to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Can I just check that you can hear me and you can see my screen?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oops, give me a second. Great, fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been asked to talk about how open contracting can help transform public procurement to deliver better goods, services, and works for everyone. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I will walk you through our open contracting approach, what it is, why we do the work that we do, and how we're delivering results with some examples from around the world. And then my colleague Gaurav from Civic Data Labs, who is one of our key partners in India, will take you through some of the specific opportunities and challenges in India and share some of the exciting work that we've been collaborating on together. But first, let's zoom out a bit and go back to the context for why we do the work that we do. We know that every year, up to $13 trillion is spent on public contracts globally. We also know that procurement is government's #1 corruption risk, and we've heard a lot about that today. Almost 60% of foreign bribery cases brought to the OECD involve bribes for public contracts, and 30% of companies in the EU tell us that corruption prevented them from winning contracts. Now, procurement has been government's #1 corruption risk long before the pandemic even began, but COVID has exacerbated these challenges as crisis situations are wont to do. And a lot of this is because of the soaring funding levels, the reduced financial controls, the frequently changing or flooding in of new actors into the market. And these low levels of transparency, the lack of digitization, the poor coordination, which is characteristic of public procurement, have created a Hunger Games scenario, if you like, where hospitals, public health agencies, national and local governments all compete to secure finite resources, whether it's medicines, equipment, or services. Now, what this has translated into is that millions and millions of dollars have been squandered on questionable purchases. This includes ventilators that never arrived, for example, in Israel, counterfeit masks that are not fit for purpose in the US, test tubes that were useless because they turned out essentially to be mini soda bottles. And Ms. Chairperson also shared earlier on the case where a raspberry farm in Bosnia scored a $6 million contract to supply ventilators. So clearly these are huge issues that have been exacerbated. Now, touching very quickly on infrastructure, infrastructure is no different. Billions of dollars have been spent on emergency response. For example, the AIIB launched a $5 billion package for health infrastructure investment in an 18-month period covering projects across China, India, Indonesia, and many others. And billions more will be spent in the recovery phase to stimulate growth. For example, here in the UK, in the next 4 to 5 years, we're going to see £640 billion spent on infrastructure, and similarly in Indonesia, $430 billion will be spent. Now, we know that even pre-COVID, there was an $18 trillion infrastructure investment gap, and 30% of investments that were being made were being lost to corruption, mismanagement, and inefficiency. So it's clear that in the thick of this pandemic, we need now more than ever to find innovative solutions that can help to plug these gaps and to transform public procurement so that we all get the life-changing goods, services, and works that we all need. Now, the question is, how do we do this? And this is where open contracting can help. Now, open contracting has become a global norm. It's been endorsed by, amongst others, the G7, the G20, the OECD. It's an open government partnership, OGP norm, where we've got over 189 commitments to open contracting in national action plans from around the world. And of course, open contracting also complements sister initiatives like EITI and COST, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, the Beneficial Ownership Data Standards, and many others. So, what is open contracting and who is the Open Contracting Partnership, or OCP? OCP is a global silo-busting organization. We're not-for-profit and we work with governments, businesses, civil society to transform public procurement to deliver better outcomes for everyone. We do this using the power of open data, and we combine it with effective participatory mechanisms so that we can help to reduce corruption, improve efficiency, enhance competition, build credibility, and deliver better value for money. At its core, open contracting is all about publishing and using open data to empower governments, citizens, businesses to identify and fix problems. Now, Mihály talked in the first presentation about how one of the hardest parts of our work is collecting and standardizing data. So our starting point begins with 2 internationally recognized best practice data standards. The first is the Open Contracting Data Standard, or OCDS, and the second is the Open Contracting for Infrastructure Data Standard, OC4IDS. The OCDS covers the entire life cycle of contracting processes, going from start to end across the planning, bidding, award, contract, and implementation stages, whilst the OC4IDS lets us see not just contracting data, but also project level data. And this is because infrastructure projects are very complex and they often involve multiple contracts for every project. So this means that the OC4IDS helps to join up contracts to projects so you can see not just what's happening at an individual contract level, but also at the project level. And these data standards are the basis for building tools and sharing those tools so that everyone can more easily use and analyze information. But what does this mean in practice, and where does this leave us in reality? So it means that you can go from something like this, which is a real photograph of a file room in a public procurement office in the Ukraine. So you can go from something like this to something like this, a state-of-the-art, award-winning e-procurement system called Prozoro. Now, in the first year of operation alone, Prozoro helped to deliver savings of over $1 billion, and that was from the efficiency gains alone. Thousands of new suppliers flooded the market, and perceptions of corruption halved. It also means that you can better join up different data sets so that you can get better coordination and oversight. This is an example from Australia, where AusTender at the national level and New South Wales at the state level is already publishing OCDS data. Now, as more and more states publish OCDS data, what it means is that you can join up the procurement data across all the states to give you a comprehensive view of what's happening across the country. And this means that you can get better planning, better coordination, better monitoring, and it also means that it will be easier for businesses to identify opportunity and participate in tenders. Here's an example from Taiwan. Our work and the Open Contracting Data Standards and OC4IDS also helps you to do analysis like this. In Taiwan, procurement data was joined up with flood propensity data to help the decision makers identify whether or not flood mitigation infrastructure was being built in the right places. And ideally, you want to see over here in the top right-hand corner in blue that there's lots of floods and lots of spending, and down here in gray where there are few floods and less investments. But you can immediately see that there are already some discrepancies here. Now here's a COVID example. This is another one from the Ukraine, where all of the Ukraine's COVID-19 related procurement data is published in the public domain, and this is done within 24 hours. Civil society is actively using this data to monitor prices for masks, gloves, and ventilators. And in a similar vein, the Ukraine Medical Procurement Agency is using this data to help improve their planning and supplier engagement. In Paraguay, we have a similar example where, again, COVID-19 data is being published within 10 days of purchase. And what's interesting is that journalists have been using this data to identify irregularities, and many of this have been reported extensively in the media. We've seen one striking example where large volumes of tonic water were being purchased at 5 times the market rate, allegedly because it could protect against the virus. Obviously, it couldn't. So as a result of these findings, DNCP, the National Procurement Agency, have since introduced new rules for reference pricing on emergency purchases to be made public. And this means that all procuring entities can now see what the benchmark prices are, and so they know what they should be paying for specific items. Now, my final example, I'm going to walk you through one of my favorite impact stories from Colombia. And there was a question early on about whether or not data analytics can help identify collusion. And this is exactly that. So the open contracting approach helped to expose a price fixing scheme in Bogota in Colombia. Basically, what was happening was that companies were colluding to keep prices high in the school meals process. In some cases, chicken drumsticks were being priced at $20 per piece, which is 4 or 5 times higher than the market price. And on top of that, many school meals that had already been paid for were not actually being delivered, so children were going hungry. Now, it was discovered that these suppliers could do this because the way that the contracts had been tendered, they had been bundled together in such a way that effectively excluded many suppliers from participating, because the requirements needed for the suppliers not only to produce the food, the bananas, apples, pears, but also to distribute it across the school network. And many suppliers could only do one or the other. So armed with this information, the procurement agency unbundled the contracts so that suppliers could either do one or the other. They also introduced a matchmaking scheme so that different suppliers could join up together and make joint bids. And this has radically improved the situation in Bogota. We've seen supplier diversity increase by over 350%, prices went down, but most important of all, over 700,000 school meals of good quality that were nutritious were being served every day. So these are just some examples from what we've been doing across the world that has helped to deliver real impacts that are meaningful to people everywhere. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Gaurav so that he can take you through what we're doing in India. I hope that that has given you a helpful overview of how open contracting can help. So over to you, Gaurav.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear.
Yes, sounds good.
Great. So let me know if you can see my screen.
Looks good.
Yeah. Go on.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ben, and thanks a lot, organizers for IMA Global Procurement Summit, for giving us this opportunity to present our work and talk about how open contracting can transform public procurement. I'm going to talk briefly about why India needs open contracting data now. Just to give a very brief introduction of the kind of work we do. I represent Civic Data Lab. It's a research lab focusing on connecting data, tech, design, and social science. The 4 key pillars to strengthen civic engagements in the country. By civic engagements, we mean 2 specific things. Number 1, access to public information so that citizens can easily access all that information without going through cumbersome processes. And number 2, once they have this access to public information, they can meaningfully participate in the local governance and other ways in which they can strengthen the citizen participation in governance. So those are the key objectives we work with. We work in 3 main areas. The first one is public finance, and out of which the open contracting is a key pillar, which I'm going to talk about in length as part of this presentation. But there are other 2 sectors where we work in. One is law and justice, and another one is open. So just to give you a brief background of the kind of work we have been doing in public finance, we have built OpenBud's India, the largest open data platform in the country, publishing timely budgetary and spending information available for everyone, any citizen to access for free without sharing their any information, without login, without any barrier on this platform. You can also access the union budget data, which got published day before yesterday on this platform, and a couple of other time series analysis, couple of other budgetary data analysis easily available. It's on openbudsindia.org. We have built this platform with the Center for Budget and Governance Accountability. So with this platform, we are hoping to make India's budget and spending data open, usable, and easy to comprehend for citizens. While we were doing this, we realized there is another key pillar to public finance information, and that is public procurement. Close to 20 to 30% of India's GDP gets spent on public procurement. As per Competition Commission of India, we are spending a large amount of $530 billion on public procurement at the moment, which is a huge amount. And to understand where this money is going to timely participate in the public procurement process, there are certain gaps which we deal with. There are issues related to efficiency. Most of the state departments, most of the national departments as well face issue related to how to timely publish procurement information on the platforms, which are citizen friendly and accessible. Also, they face issue related to price comparison, bid management, etc. All of this exists when it comes to efficiency of public procurement. In terms of value for money, I think COVID is a very good example where we are seeing sort of a varied pricing for similar kind of contracts. The ranges are quite huge. We have seen examples in Karnataka, Himachal Pradesh, a couple of other states where public procurement has been made for few essential medical supplies and goods for the rate which were way above from the market standard. And it's not just the pandemic. In general, we have seen there are value for money related gaps and issues which exist when it comes to public procurements in India. Also, when it comes to competition, ensuring that our micro, small, medium entrepreneurs can meaningfully participate in the procurement process, there are huge gaps. We see that less than 30% of the public procurements go to MSMEs at this point, especially MSMEs from hilly region, MSMEs led by women entrepreneurs, MSMEs led by SC/ST. Public procurements to those organizations are quite less at this point. And in general, market competition is quite hindered because of single bidding and other bid management related issues. So these issues exist fundamentally in the public procurement process in India, and they have just got aggravated in this COVID-19 pandemic. One of the major problems why these issues exist is we are not able to timely publish public procurement related information in open for citizens to access. Although India has an open data policy, which is NDSAP 2012, national data sharing and accessibility policy, it doesn't cover very effectively government procurements. And even though the procurement data is scattered around different platforms, we have the mission mode project of eProcure, we have state and national level procurement platforms. Most of them have issue of capture, as previous speakers were also talking about, hindering access to public information for the citizens. And even if you bypass the capture, a lot of information is in non-machine readable format which is like PDF or scanned images, which might be human friendly in nature, but machines are not able to process that data quite well, which delays all the timely data analytics and other aspects of automation which you can do with this data. That's where we propose that India comes on board and adopt open contracting data standard and use OCDS to publish their planning, their initiation, the tender process related data, award data, contract data, and implementation information, all in open. And we're trying to see how this could be implemented on a national scale in India with the help of open contracting partnership. With that, we can probably join other countries, as Ben mentioned, who are already quite actively adopting open contracting and drawing different benefits like this. With open contracting, you can increase drastically MSME participation in the public procurement process. You can derive much more value for money for the contracts you're working on. You can ensure timely reporting of the awards, tender, and other crucial data sets, not just for citizens, but for your internal analysis and process as well. You can have more alerts and monitoring on identifying red flags, as previous speaker mentioned, identifying timely red flags from the data, bidding data, tender data. You can do sectoral analysis, how key sectors like health, education are performing. You can quickly spawn customizable dashboards, and you can use different open source tools, which previous speakers have shared, and there are much more out there, which are working quite well on open contracting data standards, so that you can reduce the technology costs. And with all of this, you can further increase civic engagement in your geography. So we started our experiment with Himachal Pradesh as the target state. Himachal Pradesh is one of those states which is publishing proactively a lot of fiscal information in open. They publish their budget data, spending data quite on a timely basis. So we thought we would also check out their public procurement information. So we looked into data from two sources, the Mission Mode e-procurement platform, and also the HP tenders, Himachal Pradesh tenders platform. We collected all the tender information which we could get, bypassing the captures on a timely basis. You can see on your left, these are the tender details you see of a particular tender which is being published in open. And on the right are some other data fields related to that particular tender and the documents which are published for a particular tender and the different details, metadata associated with it. So we collected all this information and tried to convert all of that to open contracting data standard. It took us some time, but once we were able to convert it, it was looking like this. Something which is very easy to consume, something very easy to work on. Even you can do basic data analytics in your Microsoft Excel or any other spreadsheet tool, work with data. We also took it to the next level and developed something known as Health Procurement Performance Index. We call it, I'll call this as HAPPY. Himachal Health Procurement Performance Index lets you explore the procurement data from 2017 till 2020 in a much more granular manner. It can help you analyze procurement trends via sustainable development goals. We are specifically covering sustainable development goals related to public health and water and sanitation. You can monitor it via type of activities, like major works, etc., and trainings and more. And you can have different indicators on efficiency, value for money, and competition to further drill down. And then we have also KPIs like this, like average number of bids received per tender, average days taken for bid evaluation, spending per capita, where we are trying to analyze treasury level spending on the procurement, average difference between award and tender value, number of tenders concluded after the validity days, and average days allowed for bid submission. Along all these KPIs, you can compare all the districts for each financial year and generate a detailed report card for each district in Himachal Pradesh. This report card may look something like this. We are looking into Kinnaur's report card for financial year 2019-20, and you can see how Kinnaur ranks compared to other districts in Himachal Pradesh. We have seen that the bid submission period was close to 14.7 days, although the manual for procurements released by Indian government say that at least 21 days should be allowed for bid submission. We also saw that the bid evaluation period took as much as 157 days in some cases, which is quite huge. We also witnessed that the district overruns the cost of rupees 38 lakhs in total across 3.5 years. And we also witnessed that the district received 2.4 bids per tender, and out of which 2 tenders were contracted after the contract period. The contract was expired. So these are the kind of insights you can get for on a district level for health and water and sanitation related procurements. And on the left, you can see their score on different indicators like internal efficiency, value for money, competition, and the overall score for the district. We also looked into specifically infrastructure for Himachal Pradesh, and we witnessed gaps there as well. We could see that for district of Hamirpur, the average duration between tender end date and award date went as big as 650 days and above, which is quite concerning. So you can drill down this data, slice and dice it as per your needs, and draw different analysis out of it so that you can timely take actions and timely report on ground what are the kind of major bottlenecks we face. Lastly, we have done this experiment, we have done this pilot for Himachal Pradesh, but this could very well be expanded to all other states. Since Himachal Pradesh is using JEPNIC platform, which is NIC's platform of publishing tender information in open. These are other 21 states who are using it, and this could be easily scaled to them. We are also working to figure out how non-JAPNIC states using their own e-procurement system can also adopt OCDS, Open Contracting Data Standard. As the next steps, what we are going to do is conduct more capacity building sessions, advocacy sessions with certain states. We have already got our feet in Himachal Pradesh, but we would like to expand to other states. We have seen huge interest coming from Assam. We have already conducted a few introductory session about open contracting data standard with them. We would also like to collaborate with Yamini, who is here, to see if Odisha can also adopt open contracting data standard. We already are in talk with other states like Uttar Pradesh, Tripura, to see how open contracting can become a norm in those states as well. We have also given a very detailed recommendation to Union Budget and are working to give similarly detailed recommendations to state budgets to adopt open contracting. And lastly, we are working to create more knowledge sharing resources and guidebooks related to open contracting, especially in Indian context, and some of them also in local languages, so that other states, other finance departments can easily adopt that. So with that, I would just close my session. You can get all the slides with this QR code. and you can reach out to me for any further questions and possible collaborations. We are quite open for that.
Thank you, Gaurav. Now there's some chat box, some questions are there. I request the speakers to go through the chat box and take up the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Perhaps I can start. So there were two questions for Gaurav and I, maybe three questions now. And the first was about how do you strike the balance between confidentiality and transparency? And this is a great question. I think very often there is this nervousness around breaching confidentiality. So the good news is that Open Contracting has written a report on exactly this issue. If you go to our website or if you Google Open Contracting plus myth busting confidentiality, you'll come up to it as well. And we can also share the links later on. So the short end of the story is that there are a lot of misconceptions about what can and cannot be disclosed. And by and large, what OCP and Open Contracting as an approach promotes as international best practice doesn't breach any confidentiality rules. There are also, for example, many arguments that claim that publishing this type of information actually promotes collusion. But in reality, research tells us that it has the opposite effect, that publishing this type of information decreases collusion. So that's just one example of the many myths that we've busted in that report. So I really encourage you to look it up. The second question is whether Open Contracting or OCP produces any rankings on countries. The short answer is that we don't, because the model that we adopt is not about naming and shaming. It's not about highlighting which country is doing better than others, for example. And part of that is because different country contexts apply. There are lots of different things going on in different countries, so it wouldn't be fair to have a blanket comparison. What we're really looking for is to drive transformation, to deliver real meaningful change that have real social impact or social value and environmental impact, and improvements in the way that public procurement is designed, procured and delivered. But we do have many different country reports on what is being done in different countries, some of the success stories. Again, if you go to our Open Contracting website, you'll see lots of impact stories and progress stories from around the world, from Latin America to Asia to Africa and Eastern Europe. And that will hopefully give you some inspiration on what we're doing, where and why, and how that's being achieved, as well as many reusable tools that are free to use and reuse so that you can replicate these excellent efforts in your home countries. I'm going to hand over to Gaurav because there was a question specifically for you, Gaurav. Or of course, if you wanted to add anything on those first two questions in the Indian context, that would be great.
Yeah, I think you covered it quite well, Ben. It's difficult to compare, even on Indian context, compare states on how they're performing in terms of public procurement or transparency, because each state has its own local context and local issues, which we have to keep in mind before we add a number to it. In terms of how many person-month efforts required to perform the Himachal Pradesh Procurement Performance Index. So we were a 5-member team and we have been working on it since June 2020. We were able to quickly turn this around in less than 4 months. And because we got right support from Open Contracting Partnership, and we reused a lot of existing tools they already have built. And that's where the amount of time which took us was substantially reduced. And what we hope is whatever we have created could be now scaled to other states. So if we were to replicate this to, say, Assam or Odisha, the amount of time would be much, much less than 4 months. And in 4 months, we target financial years, or we can now probably go to much more financial years if there is right support from the state departments.
And I should also mention, just to add to what Gaurav was saying, that Gaurav and his team from Civic Data Labs actually won an international innovation challenge that Open Contracting hosted, where we had almost 80 applicants from around the world, and they did an incredible effort in a very short period of time and came out as the champions. So I think this really demonstrates, what can be done, and if Civic Data Labs could do it in such a short turnaround, imagine what the possibilities are if we had all the right stakeholders on board in a longer time frame and resources, etc.
Yeah, thank you, Bernadine. India is a vast country, and it is having around 30 to 32 states at present, I believe. So every state is having its own tendering arrangements, where the terminology is different, where the process is different, where the timelines different. Even though we have a general financial rules for the entire country, we have, but most procurements are done by the central public sector agencies and the state public sector agencies, like where Yamini is the MD. So everybody is having their own timelines, their own terminologies, and bringing it on a same platform itself is becoming a big challenge for any anti-corruption activities in India. And particularly the civil society is not that much questioning in India like in other countries. For example, in Botswana, what I have seen, what you are answering about the myth and reality of that confidentiality and transparency. There, what I have seen is in Botswana, after the tender is evaluated, the tender evaluation report is being rotated to all the parties who have participated in the tender. They call it as a holiday period. After 7 days holiday period, if there is no complaints, the L1 is declared. So the transparency is the key for success in tendering, and you get the value for money, and you get the quality, and everything will come with that. So competition, transparency, and value of money, it has to be intertwined. It should be on a open data only. It can happen. So I will like to summarize all the three speakers, rather four speakers, and I would like to say that whether it is a pandemic or not pandemic, the procurement always attracted corruption. So that is, but it only accelerates corruption, the pandemic, because whether it is a tsunami or whether it is a COVID-19, the tsunami, the data is published by the Integrity Vice Presidency of World Bank, what happened in Indonesia, and the contracts have been, the prices have been inflated, and the tenders have been awarded under nepotism and cronyism was followed heavily, and that type of data we have received. So on the summation, I would like to sum it from the UNODC. What UNODC says about is, enhance the integrity and accountability of public sector, it should happen first. And then public sector decisions and policies on COVID-19 related relief measures should be transparent and available to public. That is very much important. The public is allowed to challenge. So it should be available. But what I have seen is people are publishing the NIT details when the tender will be floated, and even the estimated cost is also sometimes not published, or the timelines are very, very critical. They are not giving the enough timelines even as per the GFR, even as per the manuals they follow. And the availability and whom the tender was awarded, the detail, and what is the cost of the tender award, whether the work has been completed in time. If these data should also be made available in the e-procurement portal, which will be easy for the people to look into the bidders' quality of bidding and quality of completion of work and the quality of work and the amount they quoted, it will increase definitely the transparency, which may happen in time, and ensure accountability and transparency in decision making. That should be made clear. Avoid conflict of interest in decision making. This is very high topic which we all are discussing as anti-corruption people, how to avoid the conflict of interest. In COVID-19 or any this type of situation, the conflict of interest is becoming very high as per the empirical data analysis which is being done by the UNODC or GRECO or by the OECD countries. And then ensure clear and transparent procedures for the distribution of relief measures for private sector. That is very much important, because particularly in the health sector, the private sector intervention is very much rather than in other sectors. So private sector corruption is very much to be watchable in the health sector, and reduce opportunities for bribery in administration. That is very much important. And then keep the records on all the procedures and procurement. What she also told, Yamini also told, they are keeping documentation of circumstances in which special extraordinary decisions are taken. That is very much important, because after 10 years, if any investigation happens, if this thing is not recorded properly, it may lead to disadvantageous position the people to explain at that time. So all the decisions should be spelled out clearly and why this has happened. And another is protect the most vulnerable health sector. That is very much important, because any mistakes or misprocurement happens in the health sector, the loss of lives may be there. So people should be doubly cautious about working in the health sector. And then strengthen whistleblower protection. Naturally, whistleblower protection has not started so strong in India, except Government of India has adopted the Central Vigilance Commission, a nodal agency for the Whistleblower Act, which is called in India Public Information Protection Act, that is called PDP. So still, but it is not being enacted in the Parliament. We are waiting for it. And strengthening the monitoring, audit and oversight mechanisms. This is very much important in when it is being done. So at least what I will say that there may be a compelling reasons to relax stringent procurement rules in emergencies. I agree, to allow for a fast response proportional to the population needs. Yes, it is very much required, but a lessening of oversight and ex-ante checks must be compensated for, by which more extensive ex-post checks that should be advertised widely to deter public officials from abusing discretion. This should also happen. Okay, we allow that it has to happen, but more extensive ex-post checks that should be advertised widely. The public should be allowed to participate. So CSO's participation is very much important. I hope in future we will have the good CSO participation. And with this, I would like to thank all the speakers, and I request the delegates to actively participate, not only in this, to actively participate in future also. We all are available, and our email IDs will be available. If anything, if they want to discuss, they all are welcome. I thank you again, all the speakers, for gracing this occasion. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Many thanks for a wonderful panel, and special thanks to Mr. K. Rajendran for chairing the session so very well. Let's have a round of applause for the session chair and the speakers.